When you have a bunch of people in a room talking, slightly tired old trope, but sort of think about the hourly salary of every person in that room, multiply it by the amount of time in that meeting. You're talking hundreds, often thousands of dollars for a meeting. That is a really valuable piece of time.
Well, at the very least, it's a very costly piece of time. Whether it's valuable or not.
That's a very good point. That is a very good point. If you talk about return on investment, right, ROI, the value needs to be higher than the cost.
You're listening to the Startup Podcast. This is an educational episode, in-depth masterclasses about the concepts essential to building, running, and investing in Silicon Valley-style startups. Whether you're a founder, investor, or operator in a startup, you'll gain insights into the principles that power high-growth disruption the same way Facebook, Google, and Uber do it. The conversation starts now.
Hi, I'm Yaniv Bernstein.
And I'm Saad.
And in today's episode of the Startup Podcast, we're going to talk about meetings. If there's one thing that seems to unite all of humanity, is that meetings suck. But today we're here to tell you meetings don't suck, bad meetings suck. And the truth is, most of the meetings in the world are bad meetings. So we're going to go through different ways in which meetings are bad and how you can avoid those pitfalls so that you can actually have meetings that don't suck. And let me tell you, once you do that, your world will never be the same. So stay tuned, and we'll talk all about that right after this break. Whether you're starting or scaling your company's security program, demonstrating top-notch security practices and establishing trust is more important than ever. Vanta automates compliance for SOC 2, ISO 27001, and more, saving you time and money while helping you build customer trust. Plus, you can streamline security reviews by automating questionnaires and demonstrating your security posture with a customer-facing trust center, all powered by Vanta AI. And it gets even better. Just for TSP listeners, you can get $1,000 off Vanta when you go to vanta.com/TSP. That's VANTA.com/TSP for the Startup Podcast to get $1,000 off.
All right, before we jump straight into it, first we've got to remind you about the Startup Podcast Pact, which asks if you're getting some value from the show, listen to a few episodes, liking what we do, we only ask for a few things in return, which is to please subscribe and rate us in your favorite listening app, subscribe to us on YouTube, and share us on your favorite social network. It helps feed the algorithm, helps us grow the show, and help more founders like you. All right, with that, on with the show.
Okay, Chris. So like I was saying, people hate meetings. It seems to unite everybody. And quite often the solution seems to be, hey, let's get rid of meetings. And you're like, hey, Shopify got rid of all their meetings or whatever. But, I think that's a lot of that performative theater. The truth is, meetings are an incredibly valuable part of how any organization works. Without meetings, you really have a lot of difficulty staying in sync, sharing context, making decisions, any number of other things. And yes, there are probably a few organizations out there, the exceptions prove the rule, that operate well without any sort of meetings. But for most of you, meetings are going to be a really important tool in your toolkit. So why do people hate meetings so much? In my view, Chris, it's because most meetings suck. We want to help you figure out why your meetings suck. We've got a few facts and rules about meetings. And at the end, hopefully you can implement them. This is a very actionable episode, and it will be a much better world for you.
Yeah, for me, you might imagine meetings are like a microcosm of your overall ways of working in company culture and a microcosm of relationships in general in life, right? If you have no shared context, if you have no shared, not rules, but methodologies, if you have no shared outcomes, deliverables, OKRs, obviously meetings aren't measured in OKRs, but outcomes, your meeting is likely to suck the same way your company culture is likely to suck, the same way your relationships are likely to suck. And so meetings then need like a kind of a mini version of all of the things that make a relationship and interpersonal interaction work well.
Yeah, I mean, that's actually a really good point, Chris. You can nearly see the fact that your meetings are bad as a bit of the canary in the coal mine, as a symptom of some of the other issues that are wrong with your organization rather than a cause. But they're a very convenient scapegoat. So this is how we're going to do it, Chris. We've got 5 facts and 1 bonus fact about meetings. And if you understand those facts and act in accordance with them, your meetings are going to get a whole lot better. So let's start with fact 1. And fact 1, Chris, you've kind of touched on this already, is that meetings without an aim are aimless meetings. What that means is, like with anything in life, like with your startup itself, If you don't know what you're trying to achieve with a meeting, you're not likely to achieve it. This seems just trivially true, and yet it is so often missed, right? I've seen a lot of startups where the word agenda is kind of a dirty word because it sort of sounds old-fashioned and corporate. Now, there are a lot of old-fashioned and corporate type agendas out there, but if you think of an agenda as the aim of the meeting, here's what we're trying to actually achieve with the meeting. Here is our clearly stated goal for the meeting. Then of course it's essential to have an agenda. Of course it's essential to have an aim.
Like so many things in startup land, so many things in life, the advice is easier to give than to follow. And it comes down to a lot of nuance and implementation detail. So for me, a good ad hoc meeting probably has a fairly precise agenda. Like we want to figure out this particular knot, we want to untangle this particular problem, we want to make a decision on this particularly difficult thing. But I'm also a big fan, and we're going to touch on this in more detail down at Fact 4, about recurring meetings that might not have a very precise agenda, like we need to solve or make a decision on this one thing, but their purpose is very, very clear. So what I like, for example, are recurring cross-functional alignment meetings that occur once a week. In larger companies, a recurring, let's say, product and operations sync, and a recurring product and regulatory engagement sync if you're in fintech or in healthcare. These meetings might seem like just space fillers or like, hey, if you don't have a clear agenda, then cancel the meeting. But what they tend to do, in my estimation, in my experience, is they force two groups that can quickly drift apart, or multiple groups and factions that quickly drift apart, to meet on the regular, to be held accountable to that cadence, to share their perspectives and worldviews, and to make sure that they have a continuous and regular meeting of the minds. It's still best if the people come to those meetings prepared with an agenda, and there is a kind of a pattern that you run through, like, hey, here's our update, where are you, great, thank you. But even in the absence of that, the bringing together of these minds and the, hey, what are you working on, unearths a lot of implicit considerations, misalignments, concerns, ideas that I find priceless. And so I'm always skeptical of people like, well, that's just a recurring meeting, cancel it. No, there's in my mind, a cadence or a lattice of basic recurring meetings that need to occur depending on the structure, shape, and participants of your org, especially as product managers.
Let's put a pin in this one. Let's come back to recurring meetings. Let's come back to sync meetings, status sync meetings, because yes, I think at a high level, I agree with you that having a meeting where the aim, remember I said meetings without an aim are aimless meetings. So if you have a meeting with the aim of sharing context, that is a worthy aim, but it can go wrong really easily. And we'll touch on why over the course of this episode, and then come back to maybe how to have a recurring meeting that doesn't suck. So let's maybe move to fact 2, right? Which is the most expensive part of any meeting is actually the meeting itself. When you have a bunch of people in a room talking, there's this slightly tired old trope, but sort of think about the hourly salary of every person in that room and multiply it by the amount of time in that meeting. You're talking hundreds, often thousands of dollars for a meeting. That is a really valuable piece of time.
Well, at the very least, it's a very costly piece of time. Whether it's valuable or not.
That's a very good point. That's a very good point. So if you talk about return on investment, right, ROI, the value needs to be higher than the cost. And so what that means is usually you need to spend time preparing for a meeting because that is lower cost, right? Especially if you are the facilitator of that meeting. And I think that's something I kind of want to talk about as well. There needs to be someone driving the meeting, right? And if you're driving the meeting, you better be well prepared for it, right? You need to make sure the meeting does have an aim, some sort of agenda, or at least an understanding of what needs to be talked about. You need to make sure that the right people are in the room. You need to make sure that if there's pre-reading, that's been done. All of that stuff, that is cheap. The cost of it pales in comparison than the cost of the meeting itself. So one of the things I see that really goes wrong with meetings a lot of the time is the meeting gets scheduled, everyone rocks up, and they're like, oh, okay, let's prepare now in the meeting. Right, let's figure out what this meeting's actually about. That is really inefficient, right? You're wasting that time. The meeting goes longer than it needs to be. The value delivered by that meeting, and thanks for making that point because it's so valuable, Chris. The value delivered by that meeting is going to be lower. The ROI on the meeting is going to be lower. And so understand that if you're calling a meeting, the amount of time out of your calendar for the meeting probably is more than just the time of the meeting itself. You need to make time to prepare. If you don't have time to prepare, you don't have time for that meeting. And I think that's something that's really important to understand.
I want to highlight the point you mentioned about the driver, or what I would sometimes call the meeting owner. So yes, all the stakeholders of the meeting must be prepared, but for my money, the more important piece is that there is a meeting owner and driver. Because sometimes the people participating in the meeting, they have all the context in their head. They have the domain expertise, they have the knowledge, the institutional memory, they have the materials on hand. So maybe the preparation is little to none. But if there isn't somebody there saying, keeping the conversation on track and making sure that there aren't rabbit holes and, cul-de-sacs and dead ends, then any amount of preparation doesn't matter because somebody filibusters, somebody goes off on a random, escapade, and you just have diminishing returns. So for me, a meeting owner or driver is the critical thing. They absolutely need to be prepared and have a thrust of where they want to drive the conversation. Everybody else should be prepared to the degree necessary if their domain expertise, memory, corporate memory, and so on isn't sufficient for that purpose.
Well, actually, to riff on your final point, everyone else should be prepared to the degree necessary as determined by the meeting owner, right? And so if the meeting owner requires various people to be prepared, for example, they require a pre-reading to be done, well, then it's their job to make that expectation clear and also to enforce that. So thank you for bringing that up because it doesn't fit neatly into any one of these facts, but it's kind of cross-cutting. And I agree so powerfully, right, that the meeting needs to have an owner. You could call it a facilitator, which is what I was going to do, but I think owner's a better name because it suggests this sort of very strong accountability for the meeting actually being successful. So usually it's a person who organizes the meeting, not always, but it's the person who has decided the meeting needs to happen and is going to make sure that it is driven to a positive outcome, to a positive ROI, as we've talked about it, right? That means it needs to make sure that they know what the aim of the meeting is, that everyone is prepared, and then also during the meeting, that we stay on track. And, this is actually a really interesting role because you talk about tangents and filibusters and stuff like that. And that is a very common thing that happens, especially with less well-prepared meetings. But even with a well-prepared meeting, someone in the room can go off on a tangent. And the owner, this is nearly a cultural piece, right? The owner needs to be empowered to say, hey, we're going off track. I'm going to cut this one short and bring us back to the goal of the meeting. It can be difficult when the person who's filibustering is more powerful, which is often the case. But it's really important, right? Because otherwise you go into a meeting with one aim, you have a nice chat about something that is only tangentially aligned with that aim. You never actually meet the aim of the meeting. And then, you know what you've had? You've had a shit meeting. And as the owner of the meeting, that is on you. So you need to really feel that sense of ownership that I've just made an expensive investment, right? Think of it this way. Again, talking about the cost of a meeting, which often runs into the thousands of dollars. If you were about to spend thousands of dollars on a piece of software, you would make damn sure that it's not a complete waste. You would make sure that you actually install the software, that you use it, that you embed it into the processes of the company, that it provides value. And yet people often will schedule a meeting and then the meeting goes nowhere. They've blown a few grand and no one really cares. So feel that sense of ownership, feel that sense of responsibility for not wasting the company's resources, which is exactly what you're doing if you don't own the meeting properly.
I want to talk about two particular kinds of meetings here where we're talking about the purpose of the meeting and the cost of the meeting. So number one, a really bad meeting is a meeting to discuss the spending of a trivial amount of money.
Oh my God.
Because you're spending thousands and thousands of dollars.
You're speaking my
to
language.
Figure out a trivial decision. So just watch out for those. But more importantly, I want to talk about the particular kind of meeting whose goal is to solve an escalation. I do this a lot, and I did it just recently last night, and so it's top of mind for me. But it's a little twist on the concept of the meeting owner. So whenever one of my team, let's say a product manager, I'm the chief product officer, they have an escalation. So some executives on my tier in the org are asking, like, I don't buy that, I don't believe that, or I need you to explain that to me more. And the product manager's been pulled into kind of like an executive update to allay the fears and to give a deeper dive. I will join that meeting ostensibly not as the owner or driver of the meeting, but as the defender of my report. So the meeting is generally in the context of an escalation, not always. And my job in that meeting, even though I'm not the owner and driver, is to create space for my direct report to succeed, to defend him if he's being kind of pitted with unfair questions or questions at a different abstraction layer that don't matter. And in some cases, to translate what he or she is saying to the other executives in the room in a language they might understand better, because sometimes the operators are operating at a different level. And so I wanted to clarify that little point because sometimes I've seen leaders allow their direct report to just flounder or take over the meeting, and both are wrong. But really, you need to be the wingman or wingwoman for your direct report in those contexts.
Yeah, I think that's a valid point, right? Like you need to make sure that you have the right people in the room. And often in that type of meeting, you're one of the right people in the room. And you want to have that clear ownership. You're not the owner, but you play an important role there. So I agree, that's a particular type of meeting. I wanted to move on to fact 3 because as we go through this, Chris, of course, my devious plan is coming true, which is all of these things have these cross-cutting concerns that interact with each other, that reveal some even deeper truths about meetings. So fact 3 is that meetings expand to fill the available time, right? Nature abhors a vacuum. Meetings abhor finishing before the scheduled end time, right? If you have a 1-hour meeting scheduled, it will usually go for 1 hour. Now, the odds that the optimal amount of time to discuss the agenda of that meeting is exactly the amount of time that was scheduled are actually pretty low, right? Most things don't take exactly 1 hour to discuss. So why do most meetings last for exactly 1 hour or for exactly 30 minutes for a shorter meeting? It's because people kind of follow the logic of the meeting rather than actually following a clear aim and knowing when they have actually met that aim. Now, I would say most meetings run too long rather than too short, but it happens in both directions. So maybe let's break down each of these. So let's start with the less common case, which is meetings that run too short. That is when you've scheduled a 30-minute meeting, you have an aim, you get to the end of the 30 minutes and you still haven't fulfilled that aim, right? You really need to keep talking longer, but someone has a hard stop, right? They need to get to the next meeting. They say, hey, I have a hard stop. And you're like, okay, great. You get to the end of the meeting. You're like, well, I guess we're at time. End the meeting. And you know what? You still just haven't achieved your goal. But you feel like you've had the meeting. And I think one of the dysfunctions is there's a sort of substitution effect that happens where you had an aim, something you needed to resolve by that meeting, some context you needed to share by that meeting. You didn't achieve your aim, but you substituted the fact that the meeting occurred with the fulfillment of that aim, but you actually didn't have enough time. And that's quite problematic. It's less common, but in a sense, more costly because you think you've done something and you simply haven't. And or perhaps you've rushed. Various things like that can happen.
Another symptom of this is that emotions can run really high. So when people feel like they're boxed into a small window to make their argument and that they're running out of time, they can actually get more heightened, especially for controversial decisions or topics or meetings. And so if you schedule too little time to bring people along on a journey, to air everyone's concerns out and so on, that actually can have the opposite effect for your meeting. And so, yeah, for those meetings where there is a contentious point of discussion and you schedule, let's say, half an hour, you'll notice that the pressure cooker of that meeting actually makes it, the kind of emotions can tend to boil over. People feel even more jilted than when they came in. And as you said, Yaniv, the problem actually doesn't get solved and maybe even gets deeper.
I just wanted to actually emphasize this sort of substitution effect because I think it's really interesting and it applies across meetings. And there's kind of, some people think by reading, some people think by writing, some people think by talking. I realize when I do this podcast, Chris, quite often I think by talking. And so I only realize something as I'm saying it.
I absolutely think by talking. So like I'm if anything guilty of loving meetings because I like to think through the topic with colleagues and have them push back and ideate together. But yes, I've noticed a lot of people get very flustered by that and go like, hang on, I need time to go away and think about this.
Yeah. But I was actually talking about this podcast, Chris, because I've realized it wasn't in the prep that a lot of the dysfunctions of a meeting come from this substitution effect, where there is an objective you're trying to hit that you believe the meeting will allow you to hit. So you schedule the meeting, you have the meeting, the objective or the aim has not been met, but you mentally substitute the actual achievement of that aim with the occurrence of the meeting, right? So you're like, I've checked the box. We needed to do X. I scheduled a meeting for X. We had the meeting for X. Therefore, I've done X. But actually, you haven't done X because the meeting was ineffective, right? Yes. And so I think, this is really problematic. And that strong ownership and that strong sense of meetings having an aim is actually really core to this, right? Both for meetings that run too long and meetings that run too short. So we've talked now about meetings that run too short. Where you're like, okay, I've scheduled the meeting. We didn't actually resolve it because we ran out of time. But we had the meeting and let's move on with our lives. And yeah, it can create a lot of uncertainty. It can create a lot of stress depending on the purpose of that meeting, Chris. So it's unpopular, but it is true, despite the fact that people are stressed about having too many meetings, that there are a significant minority of meetings that are not long enough.
Okay, so let's talk about meetings that are too long. I feel like for most people, most of the time, the default meeting length is an hour, right? It's sort of just the default calendar setting in for Google Calendars. And so miraculous, miracle of miracles, every meeting and every topic and every agenda just takes 1 hour, right, Yaniv?
Yep, exactly 1 hour, sometimes exactly 30 minutes. It's a miracle. Again, this is the more common case where you've scheduled a meeting and you've stated the aim, but you haven't shown that strong ownership and facilitation of the meeting, or you haven't really stated the aim. And so the aim of the meeting becomes the meeting itself, right? Another one of these pernicious types of substitutions. The aim of the meeting becomes the meeting itself. And of course, if that's the case, then of course you're going to let it run to its full time, because how else are you going to know that it's finished? You're going to know that it's finished because your calendar tells you the meeting's over. But if you have a clear aim, for example, we need to make a decision on X, or we need to sync on Y, then what should happen with strong ownership and facilitation is once X has been decided, once Y has been shared, you should end the meeting, right? So it is a real anti-pattern for every meeting to end on time. A majority, or at least a fair proportion of your meetings should be ending early, right? Because you don't want the meeting to be too short, and you have these default slots, and estimation is difficult. You don't know exactly how long a meeting will run. So what you should be doing is saying, I'm going to schedule an hour. But if after 35 minutes, you've achieved the aim of your meeting, end the goddamn meeting. Don't just kind of blather on and let people go off on tangents and whatever. End the meeting. And if the meeting is not running efficiently, if you're like, oh, okay, we've scheduled an hour, so even if it's running inefficiently, we'll get there by the time the hour is up. No, this is a valuable resource. Give people their time back. So it is a real anti-pattern. If every meeting runs to its fully allotted time, you are doing those meetings badly. And I think that's one of the key smells that lets you know that you're not doing a good thing with your meetings.
My favorite phrase is, all right, it feels like we're done with that. Let's give each other the time back, which is another way of saying, I blocked out an hour of your life, but I can give you 20 of these minutes back. And, the older I get, the more I realize that the most precious resource, the only truly scarce resource in the universe, is your life timeline and time on this earth.
That's beautiful, Chris.
Giving someone 20 minutes back for their life is just priceless. So, yeah.
So there's actually a corollary to all of this that we're talking about, which is you should schedule your meetings fairly generously in terms of the amount of time allotted, right? Why do I say that? This is sort of painful and maybe counterintuitive, but it's true, right? If you have a decision that needs to be made and you think it will take between 20 and 40 minutes to make that decision, well, schedule at least 45 minutes for the meeting, right? Because what you don't want to do is run out of time, right? You don't want the meeting to be too short. And because you don't know exactly how long it will take, and you don't know, you need to overestimate and then schedule for that amount of time. What that means is most meetings will be scheduled for longer than they actually need to run. Great. So when they finish early, as they will do a lot of the time, end them early. People will be upset maybe to hear this because it means their calendar is going to be even more bloated. They're going to have even less unblocked time because it's going to be devoted to meetings. But it is realistic, right? It is a false economy. It is wishful thinking to schedule a bunch of meetings that are too short. So schedule them for the proper amount of time and then end them early. That is the right way to do things. Every meeting should be a bit of a different length. Otherwise, that means you're running your meetings to the scheduled amount of time rather than to the amount of time that is needed to fulfill their aim.
Yeah, actually, I've noticed this really weird anti-pattern of people scheduling 15-minute meetings to have quite in-depth discussions
Just shoot me.
that should actually take like an hour of updating someone on a full context of a full thing. And people just throw 15-minute meetings on my calendar. I'm like, what the hell are we going to achieve in 15 minutes? And so just watch out for this as you're trying to it's theater. It's, it's performative theater that, oh, look, I'm not taking up too much of your time, but actually what I'm doing is fucking up your calendar because you're going to run into another hard stop and not have achieved anything.
It's just a false economy.
Yeah. And the other thing I want to talk about is, related to all of the above is workshop meetings. Again, I don't know how popular this idea is, how best practice it is or what have you, but I think by talking and collaborating, as an advisor, I have precious little time with the companies I work with, and I don't have time for telephone and, back and forth. And I tend to also want to be a player coach. And so I personally really leverage workshop meetings. They will always take the time allotted because we want to do as much work as possible in those meetings. And I like to have all the stakeholders in the room and we just smash out a deliverable without playing a week or month-long game of telephone. For me, I'm able to create a deliverable for one of the companies I'm working with in an hour that can often take days or weeks of calendar time to get done. And so I just want to put an ad in there for like workshop meetings where you get in there and you just co-author something and you don't waste calendar time over the course of days and weeks.
I agree. And actually, where I thought you were going to go there is that often these workshop meetings don't need to be 1 hour. They need to be 4 hours or something like
That's right.
that. And I've often suggested that to people. And they're like, 4 hours? We can't afford to spend that much time. And of course, you can't afford not to. So maybe another corollary coming out of this, right? We're spitting out corollaries left, right, and center is that the variance of the scheduled time of your meetings is probably too low. I think, again, as we said, most companies, every meeting is either 30 minutes or 60 minutes. The truth is, some of them should be 15 minutes, but not many. A lot of them shouldn't exist at all, and we'll come back to that. Some of them should be 4 hours, right? Because if what you're trying to do takes 4 hours, it is a false economy, it is wishful thinking, it is ultimately delusional to only schedule 1 hour for it, because you simply won't get the job done, and ultimately the cost of not getting the job done is going to be higher, either in further meetings, in poorly formed decisions, in a lack of alignment, whatever it is, or simply in the elapsing of real time, what they call wall time, because it takes you a month to do it instead of the 4 hours it could have taken you. So just consider that. What is the variance of meeting length, of scheduled meeting length in your organization? It's probably too low.
I want to quibble with this slightly. It's coming to me as we're talking, Yaniv. I would say there's probably just a few meetings that work in terms of length. A 15-minute for like, hey, I just need a super quick answer from you. That probably could be replaced by an email or a Slack message. Half an hour for a quick update. An hour for a real discussion or real sync or a real, a meaningful workshop. So that's 15, probably should get deleted. Half hour, 1 hour. I think an hour and a half or 2 hours for a really in-depth workshop is probably as long as you want to go. If you get to 2.5, 3, 4 hours, people are fucking exhausted. And if it feels like this is meaty enough that you're heading towards thinking about a 3 or 4 hour, what you probably have is an offsite. So you probably do a morning for 2 hours or 2 1 hours. You have lunch, you have an afternoon for an hour or 2 1 hours or a 2 hour. But I think you start to hit diminishing returns at the 2.5, 3 hours. People are like, oh, I'm fucking done with this topic. And so I would say, for my money, half hours for quick stuff, an hour for most workshops and alignment meetings, 2 hours max for in-depth workshops. And if you think you need more than that, make it a bloody offsite, get people lunch, and break it up a little bit.
I mean, yes, but that's still a 4-hour meeting, right? So I didn't say you don't get breaks. And
I'm just saying like a continuous workshop for 4 hours feels like a nightmare to me.
And actually, it now occurs to me that we've never done an episode on offsites, and maybe that deserves its own episode. But I've actually seen at offsites the same problem, which is you're like, okay, we've got 8 hours or maybe 16 hours. It's a 2-day offsite. So we can cover off these 10 topics. And I'm like, no, because some of these topics are 4-6-hour topics. And sure, you get your coffee breaks, you get your lunch breaks and so on. But I've rarely been to an offsite that hasn't had an overpacked agenda, right? Because by definition, at an offsite, you are discussing really substantial topics. And even 2 hours will not get you there.
Yes.
Whether it happens offsite or not, it's still a meeting in that sense. So I think we're agreeing, we're just quibbling on definitions. Over 7,000 global companies like Atlassian, Dovetail, Flow Health, and Quora all use Vanta to manage risk and prove security in real time. Why aren't you? Get $1,000 off Vanta when you go to vanta.com/TSP. That's VANTA.com/TSP for the Startup Podcast to get $1,000 off. Let's move on to fact 4, which is something that I've really observed and seems to be a little bit less well understood, which is recurring meetings rot. And what I mean by that, I've seen this across many organizations. You set up a weekly sync meeting because you have a bunch of people in the company and they need to understand what's going on. Like you said, Chris, you sort of set an agenda and everybody provides their feedback and information. And you're like, what a great meeting. I loved that. Fast forward to 6 months later, the same meeting, for a variety of entropic reasons, let's say, is nowhere near as fun or effective as it was 6 months earlier, right? The purpose of the meeting might still be valid. I'm not saying you shouldn't have that sync meeting. The synchronization might still need to happen, but like the format and the people and so on, it's gotten stale. And there's something very human about this. People start going through the motions and it becomes less and less useful. And so I think that, with this observation, what you need to always be thinking is, how do I keep this fresh, right? If the aim is long-term, right? If there is a long-term requirement for these people to synchronize or to provide context or whatever, it is nonetheless incumbent on you as the person responsible for making sure that the meeting is effective to refresh it. I would say at a minimum every 6 months. That means kind of look at the standing agenda, look at the people who are invited, look at the exact way in which information is communicated, and optimize it. Because generally you will have learned some things will have changed. So, scrape off all the barnacles, but also just change things up for the purpose of novelty, right? People fall into ruts, people fall into habits. If you change how something's done, then you will actually get a fresh lease of life on that meeting and you will get more value out of it. So that's something I try to do, and it's not something that I see as a common practice. So I just really wanted to put that one out there.
Yeah, my favorite phrase these days is minimum viable. I recently posted about this idea of minimum viable products first require minimum viable problems. Recently, I was helping a scale-up restructure, and I was talking about the phrase minimum viable bureaucracy.
Ooh.
And I would say in the context of meetings, what you need is a minimum viable recurring meetings. And you want in those meetings minimum viable attendance, right? The minimum number of people in there that makes the meeting viable. And you're right, Yaniv, thanks to entropy, you need to, on the regular, prune, refresh, revisit your schedule of minimum viable recurring meetings and their attendees and make sure that they are still minimum viable and recurring.
And fresh.
Fresh, exactly.
Right. So yes, look at your recurring meetings. And again, I think it was Shopify. There was some company I've already referenced, famously canceled all their meetings. And the way that the social media ecosphere interpreted that was, in my view, inaccurate if I actually understand a bit more about what happened, which is there were a lot of recurring meetings. A lot of them were crufty, they were old, they were stale, they weren't needed anymore. So they basically said, let's zero base this thing. We're going to cancel all the recurring meetings, but not with the aim that you don't have recurring meetings anymore. Instead, with the aim that you basically figure out which meetings still need to happen, who needs to be there. You need to reschedule them. You need to rethink them. It takes this conscious effort to put that meeting back on the calendar. And I think that is smart. This idea of a spring clean, of declaring meeting bankruptcy, whatever you want to call it, delete everything from the calendar and start again. But again, with the aim that a lot of the meetings will come back in some form, but they will be optimized by that process.
Look, again, I want to quibble slightly with this because I think if you look broadly, this is kind of the Elon Musk strategy of firing and slimming down a bureaucracy like Twitter or the federal government. So I'm a little less enthusiastic about the idea of delete everything until people die, which is, the current Trump administration, and more of a fan of surgical adjustments, right? Which is to ask every leader at every level to say, go revisit all your meetings and calendars and go make some conscious decisions. The idea of like nuke the planet and start again. Look, once in a while makes sense, but it's a little bit like engineers. You a long time ago, Yaniv said engineers starting from a blank piece of code is like burning down your room instead of cleaning it, right? So this is kind of like burning down your calendar instead of cleaning it. Maybe once in a while you need the nuclear option, but otherwise I'd encourage people to just take a thoughtful scalpel to their schedule.
Meetings are less expensive to reboot than a whole piece of code. But yeah, overall, however you do it, the idea that every meeting should have to be nearly like relicensed. Maybe that's another way of thinking about it,
Reauthorized by Congress.
Meetings expire, right? After 6 months is one way of doing it. You say, okay, you have a recurring meeting, but after 6 months it goes away. And then we have to go through that conscious process of rescheduling it and re-inviting people. And just through doing that, you're optimizing the meeting. So I think that's good. Okay, let's move on to fact 5, which is nearly like the meta fact. Meetings are the last, most expensive option. We've been spending this episode, Chris, talking about the fact that meetings are really important, kind of trying to fight back against the narrative that meetings are bad. But one of the things that is true is that they tend to be overused, right? They tend to be too much a first resort or a first option rather than the last option. And, I've already talked about this idea of multiplying everyone's salaries in the room, and that's the cost of the meeting. But the truth is, it's actually even worse than that. With the scheduling of the meetings, the wrangling of schedules, the context switching, right? When somebody has to stop what they're doing, go to a meeting, then there's an actual cost before that meeting and after the meeting to their productivity. Fragmentation of people's time. All of these things make the cost of that meeting, even larger than it at first appears. It is an expensive thing to do. So Don't be scared of scheduling meetings, but understand, again, that you are doing something really expensive. And so the first question you should ask yourself is, does this need to be a meeting? Is there another, less costly way of achieving the same aim? So we're going all the way back to fact one, Chris. Meetings without an aim are aimless meetings. And so what that means is when you're thinking of calling a meeting, you should already have that aim in mind. And then take a beat between formulating the aim and scheduling the meeting. Think, is there another way of meeting this aim? It could be on some sort of asynchronous communication, Slack, email, or whatever, right? It could be, hey, I'm just going to make the decision myself because I have the ownership to do so. I don't need that input, right? It could be any number of other things that are not a meeting. And so just consider that, right? Just understand the weight, the costliness of scheduling a meeting before you do it. Take a beat.
Yeah, I mostly agree with you most of the time. This is in particular applicable to engineers who have this kind of flow state, and pulling them out of it and putting them into it is very, very costly. And so, interrupting engineers with meetings is particularly a bad thing. I really like the idea of substituting a meeting with making the decision yourself. I think all too many things are done through consensus and through endless debate and discussion and hedging and covering your ass. And I'm a big fan of just fucking doing things. So I want to do a big +1 for that. I do want to caution, though, that there is sometimes this imaginary sense that you're saving time by doing it over Slack or email. And what you're actually doing is burning calendar time. If it's easier to just get everybody in the room, not play telephone, and especially I hate these like one-on-one meetings where I met with John, and then I met with Harry, and then I met with Sally, and then I met with Tom. I was like, get them all in one goddamn meeting.
Agreed.
And just have the meeting, have the discussion. Like I sent you an email, and then we had another email, and then we're just like emailing back and forth in threads for like, get in the room, make the call, and get out. Don't trade calendar time for synchronous people time, because opportunity cost is the highest cost for a startup.
So maybe let me reframe this a bit, because I think what you're getting at is the difference between asynchronous and synchronous communication. So asynchronous means you don't all need to be doing something at the same time, right? A good example in some cases is status updates. If you send me an email telling me what you've done this week, I can read it now, I can read it later. I can read it when it makes sense for me, when it fits into my schedule, when I'm not losing that context switching cost, when I'm not getting out of that flow state, all of that, right? Or perhaps, like I was saying, and you endorsed, I've decided to make a decision, but I would like to get some people's feedback and make sure that they don't veto it. So I'll make a decision. I'll send out an email or a Slack message saying, this is what I've decided. If you've got any concerns, let me know by the end of the day. But then there are things that are synchronous, where you actually need to discuss or debate, or certain types of status updates where there is more back and forth. Well, that's synchronous. It means you all need to be there at the same time to do it efficiently. And I think what you're saying, and I completely agree with, is trying to use an asynchronous communications method, such as email, to perform something which is a synchronous task, such as collectively making a decision or debating something, is a false economy.
Be careful with the English language. A synchronous task versus an asynchronous task. Yeah, yes, something that requires synchronicity, yes.
With a task that is synchronous. Synchronous means you all need to be there at the same time. If you all need to be there at the same time, it's probably a meeting, because frankly, meetings are more efficient than Slack threads. They're higher bandwidth. You can get things done quicker. And so, yeah, that's sort of the trickle of Slack threads is one of the biggest productivity killers, where you have effectively a synchronous conversation on Slack, but it's done over the whole day, right? It's nearly like, in the olden days where people used to play correspondence chess and you would like actually post your next move to someone. It's like, okay, you're playing chess. It's kind of synchronous, but you're pretending that it's not. And of course, the games took months. And you do not want your status updates or your decision-making to take months. So just call a goddamn meeting. I agree with you on that. Okay, I wanted to share a bonus fact, because this is one of my personal little bugbears that needles at me, but there's some actual learning behind it, which is Yaniv's bonus fact is it's not a stand-up unless everybody is standing up. There's a proliferation of stand-up meetings across most companies. And, the idea of a stand-up, it comes from Agile or Scrum or whatever, which is a short, frequent, often daily meeting where you share status really quickly and you resolve blockers really quickly. And it's called a stand-up because you're supposed to be standing up, and you're supposed to be standing up because it is supposed to be informal and supposed to be short. Standing up for a long time can be uncomfortable for people. So by having them stand, The idea is you're not doing it for too long.
I just love how Silicon Valley culture has permeated the whole world. And the core of Silicon Valley culture is engineering culture. And for engineers to stand up, that's really hard.
Yeah,
So
I know.
they make it so they all want to get back to their seats.
It's equivalent to doing squats. But the problem is actually, and this is sort of a half joke, but also kind of true, is like since engineers started getting into like Andrew Huberman and like optimizing their fitness, I've actually said when we've had stand-ups that are running too long, I said, we're now all standing on one leg. Okay. The idea is there should be something driving that this is a short, focused, tight meeting. And then, we moved to Zoom. And again, when you say the Silicon Valley engineering culture is permeating, people often took the concept of a stand-up without the standing up bit. And the stand-up suddenly became half an hour. They became discussions and conversations and decision meetings rather than a very short, brief status update and unblocking session. And so if you're not standing up, don't call it a stand-up. You're fooling yourself. You're not understanding the concept. And generally, you are creating a very inefficient meeting. A quick aside is that I feel like we talked about recurring meetings rot. In my experience, stand-ups have by far the quickest half-life. They rot faster than any other type of meeting. So always consider killing your stand-ups if they're not really stand-ups. So those are the 5 facts and 1 bonus fact about meetings. And during that time, we also shared a bunch of corollaries and other important rules of thumb. So what I thought I would do just to make this super actionable is ending with a non-shit meeting checklist, Chris. And these are questions you should basically be asking yourself as you schedule a meeting. Now, question 0, I would nearly say, there's engineering culture for you. I've zero-based this, is does it need to be a meeting? So even before you go down the path of a meeting is, does it need to be a meeting? Or is there another way of doing it? That is question 0. Next question, what is the aim of the meeting? Before you schedule the meeting, figure out the aim of it, right? Because everything else about the meeting needs to follow from the aim. Who are the right number of people to be in the meeting, and so on.
And I'm a big fan of treating my meeting names the same way I treat my product roadmap names. The purpose of the meeting should probably be in the name of the meeting. I'm actually a little bit OCD about this. I'll literally call it the Growth Squad Weekly Cross-Functional Sync. So now I know who the squad is, how regular the meeting is, and what the purpose is, which is a cross-functional sync. If it's a meeting where we're supposed to do work, I'll say the new product, project name X workshop meeting. Or the hard problem debate meeting or discussion meeting. Like give the name of the purpose of the meeting in the name so that no one is left confused.
I agree with that. And then the next 2 questions, like I said, are very practical because this speaks to the scheduling of the meeting is, are the right people in the meeting? You need to invite the people who are necessary for the meeting to be effective, right? Because this is about making decisions collectively, or it's about sharing status collectively, or it's about brainstorming collectively. A meeting is a collective activity. And so having the right people there is really important. And by the way, a quick aside, I probably should have mentioned it earlier on, but one of the other dysfunctions of a meeting is I see you have a meeting with 5 people who are invited and 1 or 2 of the key stakeholders don't show up. And then you're like, fuck it, let's just have the meeting anyway. And then, of course, you don't achieve the aim because to achieve the aim, all of the key stakeholders need to be in the room. If the right people are not in the room, cancel and reschedule. Anyway, that was an aside. After are the right people in the meeting, what is the right length for the meeting? We talked about that quite a bit. People put nowhere near enough thought into the length of a meeting. Don't be that person. Put some thought into what is the right length for that meeting. Okay, now the next thing is, who is driving the meeting? I've realized I've been a bit unclear because some of this checklist is for the person who's actually driving and scheduling the meeting, but part of it is for everyone. You want to answer the question, who is driving the meeting? That might be you. But if it's not you, if you've been invited to a meeting, you should still know who's driving it, right? You should still know what's the aim of the meeting. In fact, as an invitee to a meeting, you should insist on that stuff because otherwise your time is being wasted. Don't allow that to happen. So who is driving, owning, facilitating the meeting? Next question is everyone prepared? Or rather, do you know what it takes for everyone to be prepared? And have you clearly communicated that? Do not have a meeting where a bunch of people come in cold and like I said, you're scratching your head, you're like, oh, what should I talk about? And it's like, oh yeah, I haven't prepared the document yet and you should really read that first. And then you have the meeting anyway? No, make sure everyone's prepared. And again, in the same way as if you don't have all the right people in the room, cancel and reschedule. If you do not have the capacity to all be prepared for the meeting, cancel and reschedule. Because again, what we see often, coming back to that substitution effect, is that people substitute the fulfillment of the aim with the having of the meeting. So people are very loath to cancel a meeting that's been scheduled, and maybe some people have showed up to, once they realize that its aim can't be fulfilled, because they still want to have that mental satisfaction of checking that item off their checklist and said, yes, we've had meeting X. No, you haven't had meeting X. You've had a meeting that's supposed to be about X, but it's not actually set up for success. You're not going to achieve your aim, right? And so really important, make sure everyone's prepared. And that is our non-shit meeting checklist.
I love it, Yaniv. With this checklist, I'll never have a bad meeting ever again.
Yay, it's so easy.
It's awesome.
Okay.
It's really great. All right, that was awesome. Yaniv, thanks for drafting up that agenda for us and driving that meeting. I think it's a really awesome topic. I really hate these reductive memes that come out, of like agile for everything or meetings suck or whatever. And it's just, there's so much more nuances and so much more subtlety. And as always, it's the right tool for the job and executing and using that tool really, really well. So hopefully that helps everybody that's listening to design, execute, and benefit from amazing meetings in your company.
Yeah, it makes me mad. It makes me mad, by the way, because I'm like, I've been a manager for quite some time. And in a sense, the tool of the manager is a meeting, right? And so that the sort of throwing shade at meetings is part of a culture that sometimes exists that doesn't value the work that managers do. And I would say any company that's tried getting things done without managers, and some of the Silicon Valley companies are like, we got rid of all our managers, and within 12 months they're bringing them back. And the same way, you get rid of all your meetings, you will find yourself bringing them back because they deliver real value. Understand what's going wrong, just don't throw out the baby with the bathwater. Don't go all doge on your meetings.
Yeah, if people want to do better meetings or at least follow your work, how can they find you on the internet?
Okay, so I am on LinkedIn, trying to make it less boring, trying not to feed the trolls completely unsuccessfully. I do some coaching and consulting. So I suppose, yes, if you want some of my help making your meetings better, hit me up. LinkedIn is the best place to do that too. So I'm happy to discuss some engagements there. Chris, how about you?
You can find me on the internet everywhere at Chris Saad or on my website, chrissaad.com and chrissaad.com/newsletter. And if you'd like to work with me, you can find out more about that at chrissaad.com/advisory. All right, Yaniv, another great conversation as always.
Fantastic, Chris.
Catch you next one.
Have a good one.
Bye-bye.
Today's episode of the Startup Podcast was brought to you by Vanta. Vanta automates compliance for SOC 2, ISO 27001, and more, saving you time and money while helping you build customer trust. Plus, you can streamline security reviews by automating questionnaires and demonstrating your security posture with a customer-facing trust center, all powered by Vanta AI. Over 7,000 global companies already use Vanta. Why don't you? Get $1,000 off Vanta when you go to vanta.com/TSP. That's VANTA.com/TSP for the Startup Podcast to get $1,000 off.